Out of all of the Canon RF lenses I've ever tried, the RF 16mm f2.8 STM lens is the worst, but that doesn't mean it's actually too bad. I use it for pretty much every single video that I make, and I'm actually using it right now as well. So let's take a look at what's so bad about the lens and what are the good things with this lens, because there are a lot of good things with this lens as well. Now, before going any further, I just want to say that I'm not sponsored by Canon in any single way, so all of these opinions are purely my own. Let's start off with the build of this lens. The first thing you notice is that it's a very small lens. It's just a really tiny lens, and even though it does feel kind of solid, the size and the weight of the lens make it feel cheap, which at around 300 bucks it is a cheap lens, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that it also feels a bit cheap. The front element of this lens is also really small, and it's actually kind of cute how small it is, and the filter thread is also really small, so that just means you're gonna have to buy small filters if you want to use filters with this lens, or if you have big filters already in your bag, you can buy step-up rings to use those big filters with this small lens. That being said, the smaller filters are usually also cheaper, so that might actually be a good thing for you if you want to save some money. And even though I do usually prefer smaller lenses over the big ones, this lens is a bit too small for my hands to comfortably hold, and it also causes some issues with the operation of this lens. So traditionally in a prime lens you'd only have a manual focusing ring as well as switches for autofocus and manual focus as well as image stabilization if the lens has that. But in Canon's new RF lenses you also have a control ring which lets you control things like exposure settings or the focusing area or a few other things. But with the RF 16mm as well as some other tiny RF lenses you only have one ring and one switch to let you decide if that ring is a focusing ring or the control ring. And this does sound pretty convenient, doesn't it? Because if you're using autofocus, you're not really going to use that focusing ring anyways, but it's not convenient at all in practice. When you have the switch set to the focusing setting so that the ring acts as a manual focus ring, the camera will still keep on continuously autofocusing if you're shooting videos and you have the servo AF turned on, or if you're taking photos and you have pressed the shutter. So in order to make the lens a manual focus lens, you'll also have to tweak the settings of your camera to actually tell the camera that you don't want to autofocus now, but you also have to do the same switch with the switch on the lens, so that just doesn't make any sense to me. And you can call me lazy because of this, but I don't want to learn a new way to use my camera just because of the way a single lens is designed, because all of the other lenses that I use work in a better way in my opinion. This is also something that I have not gotten used to with the 6 months of using this lens with every single video that I make. So this might not be a big issue for you, but just know that there is only one ring in the lens and a switch to let you decide if that ring acts as a control ring or as a manual focusing ring, depending on the way you have set up your camera. And the way I shoot, this just doesn't really work for me, because I am constantly switching between manual focus and autofocus while shooting videos, so this just doesn't really work for me. But now it is time to talk about the good stuff about this lens. The image quality of this lens is actually pretty good, and for a Canon lens that is less than 300 bucks, it's actually surprisingly good, because usually the better Canon lenses are a lot more expensive. It's decently sharp, and I have not seen any big issues with chromatic aberration or fringing. You do have a bit of distortion and vignetting going on with this lens, but those are easily corrected with the lens profile corrections either in camera or in post. And Canon has actually confirmed that they are building these new RF lenses so that they are not optically perfect, because they can fix those small issues with firmware, and this makes it easier and cheaper for them to build the lenses, and they can also make them a bit smaller. So that's just better for us consumers because they're cheaper, smaller, and they're still better. So it's a win-win for everyone. So you shouldn't even see images taken with an RF lens that are perfect without corrections because of the way Canon builds these lenses, and it's actually very common with other lens manufacturers as well nowadays. And when you apply the corrections, that's when you actually reach the focal length the lens is supposed to be. So for example, a 16mm lens takes a photo at around 14mm, and when you correct those issues, that's when it becomes a 16mm lens. So you might think you're losing a bit of kind of room with the corrections in the sides of the image, but you're actually making it a 16mm photo, and what you're buying is actually a bit wider than what they say it is. The RF 16mm also handles flares pretty damn well even without the lens hood, which does not come in the box, but you can buy it as an optional accessory. So all in all, I really have no complaints about the image quality of this lens, which is a really good thing for a lens this cheap. When it comes to the autofocusing of this lens, I think it's just fine. It gets the job done, but there's nothing really too special to say about it. It works, but it's just a very basic Canon STM focusing motor that you would see in a lens like this. With a talking head or a vlogging setup like this, it does the job really well. I've never seen any issues with the focusing of this lens, even wide open, so it gets the job done just as it should. But with all of this being said, when you're taking photos in the servo AF mode, it does sound like the lens is hunting for focus all the time, and it does sound kind of horrible, but even though it does sound like it's hunting, all of the photos turn out to be in focus. Because the lens is so wide, the focal plane is also going to be really wide, so that makes the job of the autofocusing a lot easier. So even though the focus might be a tiny bit off, you cannot even see it because the focal plane is so wide. And that is also why you'll hear the focus motor hunting, but you can't really see any major differences in the images, and for videos it will slow down the focusing a bit to get rid of the noise of the focusing motors. Now if you want to have an out-of-focus background with a lens this wide, you're gonna have to focus very close. So how close can you focus with the Canon RF 16mm lens? The minimum focusing distance is 13 centimeters or about 5 inches away from the sensor of the camera, so that's very close for a wide-angle lens like this, but that's also something you can expect from the new Canon RF lenses. So you can get a blurry background at f2.8 with this lens, but if you're shooting that close with a 16mm lens, you're really gonna have a distorted object in your image. But if that's the look that you're going for, then by all means just do it. You can get the blurry background with this lens. This lens also doesn't have any IS built in, so you're limited to the IBIS of your camera if you have that, but the IBIS of Canon cameras is so damn strong that you wouldn't even need IS for a lens this wide. But the IBIS of Canon cameras is even a bit too strong, so it causes a lot of wobbling in the edges, in the corners of the image with wide-angle lenses like this. So it would be a nice thing to have the IS, especially when you're shooting videos handheld, because you are gonna get a lot of wobbling just using the IBIS. When it comes to taking photos, the wobbling issues really aren't a big deal at all, so you wouldn't really need IS for this lens if you have IBIS in your camera and you're taking photos. So if I don't think this is an impressive lens at all, then why do I keep on using it for every single video that I create? Well, the answer is really simple. I don't have any options. I want to have a fast wide-angle lens with reliable autofocusing for these talking head setups like this one, and I want it to be at least an f2.8 lens, so the only options that I have are this lens and then the 15 to 35mm f2.8 lens, but that lens is over $2,000 and I'm not filthy rich, so I cannot afford that lens. I also prefer having a native RF mount lens, so I don't want to buy the adapter and an EF mount lens, even though I know that is something I could do. I just don't want to do that. But if and when Canon or a third-party manufacturer makes a lens that is at least 16mm, at least f2.8, and I can afford that, I'm going to replace this lens with that straight away. But luckily, the image quality is really good with this lens and the autofocusing works pretty well, so I can get the results that I want out of this lens even though I don't really like to use it. But that is all I have for today about the Canon RF 16mm f2.8 STM lens. If you have any questions about this lens or about anything else, just drop a comment down below and I'll do my best to help you out. So that is all. Thank you for watching and I hope I will see you in the next one.